So after a little bit of a break for the holidays and some experimentation on seeing what would work in order to help with the curves, I finally was able to get the walls up, and let me show you how I did it. This is my third attempt at creating the walls of the Teardrop trailer. The first two experiments didn't turn out so well, but I was determined to build it along the lines of a house with studs, which appears to not be the prevailing way to build Teardrop trailers. In preparation for this attempt, I built a full-sized mock-up that included a shape that I was happy with, so I'm using that mock-up as the template to trace out the design on some of the 1/8" plywood for the exterior walls. It still needed a little tweaking to get the shape right, so I took a scrap piece of 2x2 with curves to smooth out the transition. I then used the jigsaw to first rough out the shape, and then came back with it for a second pass closer to the line. I find that I can get fairly accurate and clean cuts with this jigsaw. A sheet of sandpaper and a block helped me to smooth out all the rough edges until I finally have the shape that I want. I bought around 20 2x2s at the local home improvement store, which are actually dimensioned at 1.5 by 1.5. The insulation that I'm using, if you remember from the cabin floor, is 1 inch thick, so I trimmed a 1/2 inch off one side, leaving the other at 1.5 inches. With the milling complete, I could begin constructing the framing. The placement of the vertical and horizontal studs was determined by the expected placement of my cabinets and doors in the trailer. The passenger side was constructed and connected to an 1/8 inch piece of plywood for the exterior walls earlier. As I'm not working from a plan, it helped me to establish the studs placement. The driver's side was done by simply building it on top of the other, matching all the links and necessary angles so that they would be identical. I used the same curved scrap from earlier to determine the height of all the studs that would touch the ceiling. They were then attached to the baseboard of the trailer with 2 1/8 inch countersunk screws. Once the studs were in place, I marked out on 4 of the trimmed 2x2s at 1/2 inch increments placement for kerfs to serve as the studding for the roof line of the trailer from the front to the back. 2 8-foot studs were enough for each side, with uncurved areas in the middle where they could meet on the straight area of the roof line. I also cut out angles at the end pieces at 90 degrees with the trailer to keep the walls aligned. Some of the radii are quite drastic, and so I wrapped the curved studs in a wet blanket for 24 hours to make them more pliable. I laid down a bead of construction adhesive at the edge of the outside wall skin, and then bended the curved studs around the radii of the roofline, clamping them into place until the adhesive cured. I also took thin strips of pine, the cutoffs from the original studding, and used it along with more construction adhesive to add a little more strength. The top of the door frame was a simple enough procedure. It was a 29-inch piece with the same 1/2 inch distance between kerfs. I marked a line at 36 inches from the bottom of the vertical post, and then set a crossbeam with a 45-degree angle on the other side and just attached it with screws and adhesives. I was still worried that the adhesive alone would not be strong enough with curved studs, and so I wanted to also screw them into the vertical studs, but the kerfs would make it impossible to do so. I decided to fill all the kerfs with epoxy. After the epoxy cured, I cleaned up and leveled the external studs with a hand plane. The door entrance was a fairly simple affair. cutting the majority out with a jigsaw and then finishing the job with a flush trim bit in the router. My technique though is not one to emulate here, but it got the job done for me. With one side framed and skinned and another only framed, I needed to add the other outside layer to the driver's side wall. I laid the two frames on top of each other with the second exterior skin lined up with the first and marked the center line of all my framing, so that after I apply adhesive to the framing, I have a guide for shooting the pins into the framework until the adhesive dries. I'm only doing the exterior side of the walls at this time because I still have to run the electrical wiring and need access to the interior of the walls. Despite my attempt to keep everything the same, some variations occurred between the driver and passenger side of the trailer. The wood did not bend exactly the same way, despite identical placement of kerfs. With the two pieces clamped together, however, the belt sander helped to even everything out. The walls are completed, and so they need to get attached to the bed of the trailer. The framing is an inch thick, so I removed the varnish from 1 inch on each side of both the driver and passenger side of the trailer, and I then secured it to the floor with 3-inch structural screws and adhesive. A couple of temporary cross braces cut to length in order to prevent it from racking too badly finish this portion of the build. It might not have been the easiest way to put up walls, but I'm pretty sure they'll be strong enough for going down the highway. I'm also pleasantly surprised at the headroom that I have in here. I designed it to make sure that I could be able to sit up in it, and even after the ceiling is put in, there's still going to be a good 44.5 inches of headroom in here, which I think is more than enough and quite comfortable. As excited as I am to finally have these walls up, I'm looking forward to getting started on part 4 right away, which is going to include doing some of the rough electrical work, as well as then putting a skin on top of the wall and then building then a pony wall between the galley and the cabin in order to make some of that separation. If you enjoyed part 3 of the build, I invite you to take a look at the first 2 parts, which include putting down the floor as well as fixing some structural issues with the trailer to make it compatible for a teardrop. There will be a link to the playlist in the description down below or also in the card above. Thanks for watching, everybody, and may God bless you.